Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're diving into something called the paradox of tolerance. It's basically about this tricky question. How much tolerance can a tolerant society actually tolerate, especially when faced with intolerance itself?
Right. Where do you draw that line? It's a fundamental tension.
Exactly.
Uh-huh.
And we're looking at some key thinkers here. Karl Popper, John Rawls are the main ones in our sources.
Yep. Some heavy hitters in political philosophy.
So our mission for you today is to kind of unpack this complex idea pretty quickly, hopefully give you some surprising insights into, all those debates happening now about free speech, hate speech, societal defense, all that stuff.
It really gets to the core of how a society based on openness can or should deal with forces that want to shut that openness down.
Okay, let's start with Popper then. He's the one who really put this paradox on the map. He had this very stark quote.
Unlimited tolerance must lead to the disappearance of tolerance.
Yeah, that's the one. Pretty blunt. He's essentially saying, look, if you tolerate everyone, no matter what, including those who are actively intolerant, eventually, tolerance itself gets destroyed.
It becomes a kind of self-destruction mechanism almost.
Right. And it's important to remember why he was thinking this. This wasn't just abstract philosophy for him, was it?
Not at all. He was writing this during World War II. He's seeing fascism, other totalitarian movements rise up and destroy liberal societies.
So it was intensely practical, a matter of survival for democracy.
Absolutely. He saw these ideologies as fundamentally rejecting the rational discourse that democracy relies on.
But, okay, Popper wasn't advocating for just shutting down everyone we disagree with, right? He had some conditions.
He did, crucially. He argued, we only gain the right not to tolerate the intolerant when they refuse to engage in rational argument and instead resort to violence or threats.
That famous line about answering arguments with fists or pistols.
Exactly. But he was also cautious. He stressed that rational argument, public opinion, these should be the first tools. Suppression is a last resort, only when reason fails and violence begins.
Okay, so it's about the method intolerant groups use, violence and the rejection of reason.
Primarily, yes. Now compare that with John Rawls. He tackles this in A Theory of Justice.
Right, Rawls. What was his angle?
Well, Rawls started from a different place, focusing on principles of justice and equal liberty. His general position was that a just society should tolerate the intolerant.
Even if their views are, well, intolerant. Seems counterintuitive.
It does, but it stems from the idea that liberty should be as extensive as possible for everyone. However, and this is the big caveat, Rawls said this tolerance has limits. He argued we can restrict the freedom of the intolerant only when they pose a direct threat to the security of the tolerant citizens and the free institutions themselves.
Ah, okay. So if they're actually endangering the system or people's safety.
Precisely. So you see the subtle difference. Popper focuses more on the intolerant group's behavior rejecting reason, using violence.
Yeah.
Rawls focuses more on the potential impact or threat they pose to the security and the basic structure of liberty.
Interesting distinction. One's about how they argue or don't argue. The other's about the danger they represent.
You got it. Both arrive at limits, but the trigger point is slightly different.
So what's the justification for these limits then? Societal self-defense.
That's the core argument. Popper, for instance, argued that movements preaching intolerance, especially those ready to use violence, essentially place themselves outside the law. They reject the fundamental rules of mutual respect and rational debate that allow a tolerant society to function.
It's like they're opting out of the social contract.
In a way, yes. But this immediately brings up huge problems, doesn't it?
Oh, yeah. Like, who gets to define intolerance? That feels dangerous, politically charged.
Extremely. That's a major critique. The definition is slippery. And then there's the whole slippery slope argument. If we restrict this speech, what stops us from restricting other, maybe just unpopular speech later?
Right. And couldn't this whole idea be, misused by governments or groups to silence opposition they just don't like, labeling it intolerant?
Absolutely. That's a constant risk. Plus, the potential chilling effect, people might self-censor for fear of being branded intolerant, even if their views are perfectly legitimate criticisms.
We sort of see historical examples pointed to, right?
Yeah.
Like the Weimar Republic, though I know that's debated.
It is debated, but it's often brought up as a cautionary tale, a tolerant democracy potentially overwhelmed by intolerant movements it failed to adequately counter. Whether that's the right analysis is another question.
And today, you can't avoid seeing this paradox in action. Debates over hate speech laws, how social media platforms moderate content.
Exactly. These are real-world struggles trying to apply this very abstract-sounding paradox. Where's the line between protecting free expression and preventing harm, or the undermining of tolerance itself? It's incredibly difficult.
And of course, Popper and Rawls aren't the only ones who thought about tolerance limits. You have Locke on religious tolerance and civil peace, Mill on the harm principle.
Right. There's a broader context here about the general limits of liberty and speech. The paradox of tolerance is a specific, very pointed part of that larger discussion.
So, wrapping this up, the key takeaway seems to be that this paradox highlights a really fundamental dilemma. There are no easy push-button answers.
None at all. It's a constant balancing act for any society that values both freedom and its own survival.
Which leaves a pretty big question for you, the listener, to chew on.
Yeah, think about it. When you look at the debates happening around you online, in the news, wherever, how do you see this paradox playing out? Where do you think that line falls between defending tolerance and maybe going too far and stifling necessary discussion?
Definitely something to mull over.